Hello, friends and neighbors. Elliot Cruz here. Normally, I'm talking about vinyl records and collecting records. And as much as I'd love to be talking about this great 1976 Tacoma Records copy of Norman and Nancy Blake live at McCabe's, there's something more important we need to talk about. That is the disenfranchisement of American citizens. Who have cast their votes, and there's an attempt to throw those votes out. Now, I'm not talking about anybody that in any way is not qualified to be a voter, not a citizen, uh, not a resident of where they voted, or anything like that. What I'm talking about is the after the fact attempt to nullify 68,000 votes here in North Carolina. The race I'm talking about is the North Carolina State Supreme Court race between Jefferson Griffin and Allison Riggs. Allison Riggs had been elected one time to the state Supreme Court, and she was running for re-election. Jefferson Griffin is on the state court of appeals, and he was running to move up to the state Supreme Court. Any questions about how people had to be registered and what procedures would be followed were all addressed before the election. But because the election did not turn out the way Griffin wanted it to, then he and his cohorts have attempted to overturn the election by claiming that 68,000 people that he handpicked from all the people that voted in North Carolina, 68,000 people, votes should be thrown out. The reasons included things like when they pulled up someone's registration, the identifying feature of the last four digits of their social security number didn't appear on the screen they were looking at the time. It may well have been in other places in the registration paperwork or digital files, but they didn't see it, so they challenged it. They challenged missionaries and U.S. servicemen who voted overseas. They challenged the children of missionaries and U.S. Military personnel who had been living overseas with their parents and turned 18. And it had previously been ruled that those U.S. citizens could vote in the state where they had lived before relocating overseas. So it's ridiculous what's going on. Griffin lost the election by 734 votes. All proper things to do to double check and triple check the vote were done. The vote was tallied. There was a recount. There was a paper ballot sample count. Each county had to certify their results and send them to the state of North Carolina Board of Elections. All that was done. Yet we're sitting here over 3 months separated from the election, and it is the last election in the United States. It's still not certified.
Democracy is the most powerful tool we have. And if we don't stand up for our democracy, we're going to lose. That's right. Because we won't have no choice in elections. Democracy gives us the right to select who we want to represent us.
That's right.
It looks like the game is to make people spend their money while they play a game. And this game is serious about American democracy. The last time I checked, Mr. Griffin went before a judge, swore an oath to the Constitution.
That's right.
If you swear an oath to the Constitution, you ought to follow it.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And the votes have been counted. The courts have said he lost. He ought to live by it and move on. There'll be another day.
That's right. Move on.
But that Burnett to continue to drag it out, have the court not be able to operate with full numbers on it is wrong. So I say to Mr. Griffin, do your duty, concede the election, and move on.
The State Board of Elections, Griffin brought these before the state board, and he lost. They ruled that his arguments were not legitimate. And also it's important to note that he and his people handpicked where they would go looking, and in which counties and which demographic groups they would look at and things like that in order to try to get the results they wanted. Find some inconsistency with something in their registration or anything like that. It's also important, so based on this argument, we would need to go back and check everybody's registration in the entire state that voted to see if this is the case anywhere else. So I don't think they're going to do that. It's ridiculous, and it's a mess. So we had a rally here in my home, Lillington, in Harnett County, rural North Carolina, and we voiced our concerns and heard from several people speaking, and Allison Riggs, the state Supreme Court justice, was able to join us and speak to us about it as well. Here she is explaining the three buckets of people who they claimed their votes should be thrown out.
68,000 people that he's seeking to toss their ballots, but there's three main categories. The first one, the biggest one, is this 60,000 bucket where there's some issue with with the voters' registration. And so, like you said, this is the people who, according to my opponent, the voter registration file doesn't have the last four of the social security number or the driver's license on it. Well, let me first say that he's wrong. More than 31,000 of those people definitely do have that number associated. Our elections, statewide elections system has needed to be replaced for 25 years, and the General Assembly will not fund it. So it's one of these, it's hard for me to explain. It's like one of these applications where it depends how you query the data.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so like they queried it one way, but it exists elsewhere.
Oh, right.
And the old paper registrations all exist at the county level too.
Right.
So one, they're wrong about most of them. Two, they're wrong about folks like my parents, who it was just when they registered, they used their military IDs, and the election workers didn't ask for more information. My parents had it with them, but they've never gotten any indicia that there's anything wrong with their votes, and trust me, they are eligible voters. So that's the first bucket. The second bucket is about 5,500 voters. They're voters who vote from the military or overseas. They're called UOCAVA votes because there's a federal law called the UOCAVA Uniform and Overseas Citizens Voting Act. And these are people that North Carolina said, yes, we have a photo ID requirement, but the people who are serving on submarines and the people who are using this, UOCAVA voters under federal law are allowed to submit an online vote. So like the only group that can do that, but under federal law, they're allowed to do it. So there isn't a mechanism for them to submit their photo ID. And so this is a little bit wonky, but this was not a secret that they were not going to be required to show their ID. It was talked about in the legislature, it was talked about in the state board. A rule came out of the state board that went through this rules committee with a legislative appointees on them. And this rule was approved that UACAVA voters weren't having to mail in separately a picture of their photo ID because it's not an absentee ballot like a non-uniformed voter would cast from, you know, grandma's house across the country. So 5,500 of those, but interestingly, those 5,500 are only in 4 of the most Democratic counties in the state. There are 32,000 voters cast votes that way. But they have decided to challenge only 4 counties.
They just cherry pick.
Well, they said the defense given was, well, those are the counties that gave us the data when we asked.
Yeah, right.
So that's where that 5,500 came from. And then there's about another 1,000 voters who they are the children of overseas and military families who turned 18 while abroad with their families. And since 2011, there has been a state law that clearly says these folks can vote. These are the children of people who served at military bases in Italy and Korea and have grown up overseas. They are the children of missionaries serving out on the missions field. It has, for 15 years, not been a question that these people can vote, and now my opponent is saying that he's calling them never residents because they weren't 18 in the state. But we've been very clear that the parents' domicile, the parents were residents of North Carolina before they went overseas. And there's good reasons why we want to encourage military service. We want to encourage mission service.
We want to encourage voting.
Right. We want to encourage voting.
And I thought her closing speech to the crowd really hit home. This is not about whether somebody's a Democrat or Republican. This is about the preservation of our democracy.
And so I was an election lawyer before I joined the bench, a voting rights attorney, and spent my career working to protect our votes and to make sure that eligible voters' lawful ballots were never cast aside, and certainly not for partisan political gain. We've worked too long and fought too hard for the precious right to vote for this to become a partisan tool. And so I was a long-time nonpartisan attorney, so my foray into partisan politics is pretty recent, 2 years and 3 months ago. But I know how important our courts are, which is why I stepped up to do this work to make sure that we had people on our courts who were interested in putting people over the powerful, people over big corporations, and willing to recognize the constitutional protections that we enjoy as North Carolinians, which includes a sound basic public education, and I know we all are fighting for that, the right to vote, and just the right to live our lives and organize to protect each other. So this has been a challenge. Please believe me when I'm not being melodramatic, that this is a fight for the very soul of our democracy, because this is true. If the people in power can decide whether elections are good or not, depending on if they like who wins, then our democracy dies.
That's right.
And if the people in power can decide after an election which votes count and which votes don't, our democracy dies. And this is an effort that was underway in 2020. You know, what has happened now is what the people who stormed the Capitol were trying to achieve. My election is the last uncertified election in the entire country. That's what they were storming the Capitol on January 6th to do, was to stop the certification. But it didn't work in 2020, and it didn't work in 2022. So now I think they've figured wrongly that maybe we won't stay engaged in the fight. And this is a state Supreme Court race, and so it's below the radar for way too many people. So they think they can perfect their blueprint to steal elections here in North Carolina. And if I was gonna bet on anyone, 15 years as a voting rights attorney, and I litigated all across the South and did work all across the South, if I was gonna bet on anyone, I'm going to bet on y'all to not let democracy die on our watch. And so, you know, we're battling in the courts every single day. Literally haven't gotten a break in 110 days. And it's not going to end anytime soon. I'm telling folks that the new timeline is 6 to 12 months.
Wow.
Courts take a lot, they move slowly. So we have to go to the North Carolina Court of Appeals, then the North Carolina Supreme Court. Then we have to, if the state courts do the wrong thing, go to federal district court, then the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, and hopefully not, but it could even go up to the United States Supreme Court.
What will happen there?
So interestingly, there's a lot of good federal case law on our side, and which is the reason me and my attorneys have been arguing so hard that this needs to be an issue decided in federal courts, because the federal Constitution and federal law prohibit what my opponent is trying to do, which is to say we're going to use some technicality to toss out ballots after the fact when voters were understood what the rules were told what the rules were, and complied with those rules, and we're just going to throw them away. I mean, this is what happened in Jim Crow. The registrars would look at the registrations of black voters and find some reason, a missing apostrophe, a misspelled word. They would look for those things and toss out black voters' registrations because of that. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965 explicitly prohibits that. And the people who are, my opponent is trying to toss their ballots, are disproportionately black, disproportionately young, and disproportionately women. And we know that in the history of the fight for voting rights, these are groups that have been targeted. So it's wrong, we shouldn't still be here doing this, but this is a fight that we know how to win, and it's one I believe we can do. But I know what's gonna happen is they're hoping we're gonna stop being so mad. Because that's right. Because, but I understand why they think that, because when you look up at the news and you see all the awful things that are happening, it's very frustrating. It's very discouraging. We wonder and worry, how are we going to protect each other and keep each other safe? But that is exactly the reason why we have to dig in here more. We may not be able to, in the next 6 to 12 months, right what's wrong in Washington, but we can right what's wrong here. This is a fight we can win, and if we don't win this fight, we're never going to be able to fix what's wrong in Washington, because they're going to say anytime we oust someone who doesn't serve our best interests, that wasn't a legitimate election. And so I know that there are folks here and your friends and your neighbors who are scared, who don't know what's going to happen to their votes. My parents are on the Griffin list. Both of my parents retired down here to North Carolina to be near me and my sister. My brothers move around, but my sister and I have been in North Carolina for some time now. My dad's a 30-year Navy veteran. He goes, whenever he has to show his ID for anything, he shows his military ID. He's very proud of his service. He's been deployed, served in wartime. So he and my mom went to register and used their military IDs to register to vote, which you are allowed to do. They also presented their utility bills that have their address, but military IDs don't have driver's license numbers or social security numbers, and no one asked them for anything else, and the form back then didn't say anything else. And my mom has used my dad still uses his military ID for everything, but my mom, when she voted for me last year, whipped out her North Carolina driver's license. And she's like, I don't understand. I showed them my driver's license with the driver's license number. And I'm like, I know, Mom. They didn't note it down. Like, that's literally what they're trying to disenfranchise you over. Not that you don't have a social security number or a driver's license number. That's why we're seeing military families so heavily hurt by this. And I know this is a community that has deeply, deeply supported our service members. Our service members who are deployed or serving abroad, even serving out of state. One of the people on the challenge list was the woman flying the Black Hawk helicopter that crashed in Washington, D.C. just last month. You can imagine she will not be able to fight for her own vote and voice, but I will.
Wow.
And I don't care who she voted for. Her right to vote is important. It matters. And I've talked to so many people recently who didn't vote for me, but they are upset that someone is trying to disenfranchise them and take away their vote. And I said, you know what? I don't care who you voted for. I will go to the mat to make sure your right to vote is respected. And guess what? That's what you should be demanding from every person who represents you, but certainly the people who serve on the bench, is a commitment to the rule of law and to defending the Constitution, even if you don't like the vote cast or the political outcome. So I know my parents were lucky. They got a mailer from the North Carolina Republican Party and they showed it to me. My husband and I went over to dinner and they showed me this junk mail that they got. And I was like, I didn't even know my own parents were on this list. So how many people in North Carolina, of the 68,000 voters who are being challenged, how many of those people aren't lucky enough to have a daughter who's a former voting rights attorney and sitting justice to explain to them what's happening? But you all can do that. And I see so many faces and so many connections in this community that if we get people engaged, not only is this a way to make sure that everyone's story and voice gets heard, but it's a long-term way to say, look, at some point we've got to have people of character willing to put people and the Constitution above partisan politics. It is not that much to ask. And I believe your commitment to being here today and what you're doing, that's going to help us over the long term make sure that we're electing good people to serve the state of North Carolina. So I am so very grateful to you all for being out here. It's so good to
When they start disenfranchising U.S. citizens, and in fact doing it after the fact, then we're in a very, very difficult place in our history, and our republic's in peril. So, if there's anything you think you can do to help rectify this situation, I hope you will. Everybody, I'll just remind you all, let's be kind to our neighbors. We're all neighbors. Thank you.